Hello, hello, and welcome to Turn the Tide Thursdays. I'm Desert Mermaid. Some of you that have met me in person might know me as Mermaid Cora, and this is Turn the Tide Thursdays, where I take time to read a Nancy Drew book, and you take the time to get settled in, put your fins up, and listen to this Nancy Drew mystery book. Last week I was sick, and so I read for a little bit and then I decided to take some rest. I am feeling so much better, as you may be able to tell. We are on chapter 14 today of Nancy Drew Mystery of the Glowing Eye. It's the 51st case in the Nancy Drew Mystery Stories books, and there are 20 chapters total, so we'll see where the tide takes us today. But a quick recap. We were reading about one Ned has gone missing. This is kind of the main part of this book this time, that Ned Nickerson, Nancy's very close friend, has gone missing. He's left clues around places, but each time they think they're gonna find him, it ends up not happening. So Nancy's taking a little break from Emerson College. That's where they've had their operations going on. And that's where Ned goes to college. She's taking a break to visit River Heights, her hometown, where she's living currently, and to check in with not only her father, but also her best friend's parents. That's the cousins, Bess and George. Bess Marvin, George Fane. And last we heard, Mr. Fane, George's dad, might have a clue as to what is going on in this mystery that keeps talking about some Cyclops. You know, the mythical creature in Greek mythology with one eye. Well, let's keep piecing things together as we take this time for ourselves. So, Chapter 14, Chilly Conference. Mr. Fane told Nancy that the previous day he had been on a business trip to Martin City. I had just finished my conference early, so I decided to run out to the Anderson Museum at Hager and take a look at that glowing eye you girls talked about. What did you think of it? Nancy asked him. His answer surprised her. It wasn't there. You mean somebody took it? Nancy exclaimed. But who? George's father told her that when he went into the museum, he had introduced himself to Miss Wilkin. I said that I'd like to see the glowing eye, which my daughter had viewed there a few days before. The woman at once became very nervous, he reported. She said there was no such thing at the museum. When I insisted, she finally admitted that the eye had been removed. By whom? Nancy asked quickly. Mr. Fane replied that Miss Wilkin had said she had no idea. It happened when she was off the premises, and she had assumed that it had been taken back by the Emerson College authorities. Nancy was amazed to hear this. What else did Miss Wilkin tell you? She asked Mr. Fane. Something that contradicts what you were told, that no student from Emerson had been there in a long time. Anything else? Nancy asked Mr. Fane. No, nothing else. So I left the museum. But I thought you'd want to know what I had learned. I certainly do, Nancy replied, puzzled over this latest turn of events. She thanked Mr. Fane for giving her the information. As soon as she finished the phone call, she dialed Professor Titus. He was as surprised as the young detective had been upon hearing Miss Wilkin's story. One thing she's right about. No student from my department has gone there to study in a long time. The glowing eye never reached the college. There is no reason why it should, since it isn't our property. He and Nancy discussed this new angle of the mystery. Then the professor said, "Could you meet me at the museum at 4 o'clock? I'd like to find out more about this whole thing. Please hold the line a couple of minutes while I talk with the pilot who flew me over here. I'll see if he can take me to Hager." She put down the phone and went to talk to Glenn, who was looking at a wall picture of an early biplane. In answer to Nancy's question, he said he would be glad to take her on the errand. Nancy relayed this to Professor Titus and then said, "I'll see you at 4." Nancy and Glenn walked back to Mr. Drew's office. The lawyer still had not returned. "But Marty King is here," Miss Hanson told her. "Want to talk to her?" "Yes." Turning to Glenn, Nancy said, "Will you excuse me a few minutes while I see Marty?" The pilot nodded. "Watch the time, though," he advised. "Remember your 4 o'clock date." "I will," Nancy promised, and opened Marty King's door. "Hello," she said. "I'm sorry I missed you before and that Dad is not here now. Tell me, how is he?" "He seems fine," Marty replied. "Is there some message I can give him?" "No, but I thought I'd bring both of you up to date on the glowing eye mystery." Marty King leaned forward in her desk chair. Nancy asked, "Marty, when did you last hear from your contact?" The young lawyer did not answer at once. She seemed to be searching for an answer. Finally, she said, "Why, not recently." Nancy decided to catch the secretive young woman off guard if possible. Looking directly at her, she asked, "When did you last hear from Zap Crossan?" Marty was so amazed that she gave a convulsive start and did not reply. She jumped from her chair and came from behind the desk. Her eyes were flashing. "I don't know how you learned about him," she said, "but I'll tell you this. I found out he's a red-haired nut." Excitedly, Nancy thought, those were Ned's exact words in his note to Bert. "So I've heard," Nancy said aloud. "What I want to know, Marty, is when did you last see him?" "Recently?" "I haven't seen him in a while, and don't want to, ever again," Marty said angrily. Nancy felt that she had the advantage and pressed on with her queries. "When did you last hear from Zap Crossan?" At this, Marty tossed her head into the air and a smug expression came over her face. "Next thing I know, you'll be asking me what he told me about the glowing eye." "I did have that in mind," Nancy admitted with a low smile. "Well, how about my other question? When did you last hear from your contact, Zap Crossan?" "I won't tell you," the young lawyer said defiantly. "As you like," Nancy replied. "But I want to tell you that Crossan might be involved in a kidnapping case." "Oh, you mean your boy friend?" Marty King shot back. "Well, I'm sure Zap had nothing whatever to do with it." Marty King looked a little frightened at the information. "I'll tell you this. Zap pesters me with letters, but I don't answer them." Nancy asked her where the letters had been mailed. Marty replied, "Most of them were postmarked Emerson." Nancy stared into space. This meant that Carson was still in the general area from where Ned had been taken. She must concentrate all her efforts in that vicinity to find him. For a few seconds, Nancy was tempted to confide in Marty, but a feeling of distrust about the girl swept over her, and she changed her mind. "I must go now," Nancy said. "Thank you, Marty, for your helpful information. And I think I should warn you again. Zap Crossan is in bad trouble. Very bad trouble." "What do you mean?" Marty asked. "Are you implying that he is a suspect in the kidnapping?" "Yes," Nancy said. For the next few minutes there was a verbal exchange between the two girls which revealed nothing of importance to either one. Marty prodded Nancy to tell her more about Crossan, but the young sleuth was evasive. Finally said, Finally, she said she must leave because of her next appointment. Marty King walked with her to the door, and Nancy politely introduced Glenn Munson. The young lawyer's eyebrows lifted, and Nancy could imagine her saying, "Where did you meet this handsome young man?" Nancy was amused, but merely said, "Tell Dad I'm sorry I missed him. Goodbye. And goodbye to you, Miss Hanson." Nancy and Glenn hurried off, and in a little while they were airborne and heading for Hager. The pilot set his whirlybird down in an airfield not far from the Anderson Museum and locked the ignition. As they jumped out, he said, "I hope I'm not intruding, but I have a feeling you could use a little extra protection. Mind if I go along?" "I wish you would," she said. Professor Titus was waiting in front of the building. "You're right on schedule," he said. "Well, let's go inside and see what we can learn." Nancy introduced Glenn, and the three entered the building. Miss Wilkin gave the visitors her usual icy reception and informed them that the museum would be closing for the night at 4:30. Nancy spoke up. "Your booklet says you stay open until 5 o'clock. Miss Wilkin replied, "At times we make exceptions. Tonight is one of them." Nancy tried not to show that the woman's chilly attitude annoyed her. She said, "We'd like to explore a little while." "All right, but watch the signs and don't touch anything you're not supposed to," the prim woman ordered them. Nancy at once led Professor Titus and Glenn to the narrow hallway behind the wall where she had seen the glowing eye. Glenn searched the wall for a switch that might activate any machinery. He found one and turned the switch, but nothing happened. With sensitive fingers, he moved along, trying again and again to locate another possible contact, but without success. Professor Titus had gone around to the big room where the glowing eye had shone high on the wall. Nancy, meanwhile, had found a sliding panel in the wall near where Glenn was looking and saw a closet. There was nothing in it. The young detective stepped inside. "Maybe there's some kind of a switch in here," she said to herself, and began running one hand over the wall. Suddenly, her fingers felt strange, and she tried to pull them away, but she was not able to do so. Her whole hand was drawn against the wall. She tugged harder, but still could not move it. Before she could call out to Glenn, the panel closed. Instinct told Nancy she was in serious trouble. At the top of her lungs, she cried, "Help! Help!" Chapter 15. Abrupt Resignation. While Nancy, terror-stricken, continued to yell for help, Glenn and Professor Titus tried to find her. She was hidden from sight, and they did not know where to look. The closet she was in stifled her voice. The trapped girl felt herself becoming faint. A fleeting thought crossed her mind. If she slumped, she might be able to pull her hand to get away from the wall. Without losing her balance, she leaned backward, creating a great deal of pressure on her hand. It did not budge. By now, Glenn had traced her voice and slid open the closet door. "What's the matter?" he asked. I can't get my hand loose," Nancy whispered. I can't get my hand loose," Nancy whispered. At that moment, Professor Titus arrived. While Nancy was trying to tell him what had happened, Glenn dashed off to find Miss Wilkin. She was seated at the reception desk in the hall. "Quick!" Glenn exclaimed. "Turn off all the power. Miss Drew is pinned to the wall." The prim custodian looked at him blankly and did not move. "Is this some kind of a joke?" she asked. "No, no," Glenn assured her. "Nancy is in real trouble. Please turn off all the power in this building." Miss Wilkin jumped into action. She grabbed the keys from the desk drawer and rushed down the main hall and around the corner. Glenn raced after her. The woman reached a large panel board on the wall and unlocked the covering to it. Quickly, she pulled down several levers. At once, the place was in darkness. Glenn did not wait for her to return to the lobby. There was still enough daylight sifting through the windows so that he could easily make his way back to Nancy. The young pilot sighed in relief as he found her seated on the floor, released from the magnetized wall. Professor Titus was kneeling beside her and massaging her hands vigorously. "Are you all right?" Glenn asked solicitously. Nancy gave a wan smile. "I will be as soon as the circulation is restored to my hand and arm. They're numb." Professor Titus kept massaging them for another 3 minutes, then asked Glenn to take over. The young man seated himself on the floor and began to rub Nancy's hand and arm vigorously. "That feels great," she said. "Thank you both so much. I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't come to my rescue." Glenn grinned. "You would have thought of something," he replied. "Just the same, I'm glad you gave me a chance to help you." By this time, Miss Wilkin had come back to the visitors. Nancy explained what had happened to her and asked for an explanation. The woman turned pale. "I have no idea. This place is getting very spooky and I don't like it." Miss Wilkin seemed to soften a little. She leaned over Nancy and asked how she was feeling. "I'm practically well again," the young detective replied. As Glenn continued to massage her hand and arm, he asked, "Please tell us exactly how it felt when your hand was pinned to the wall." Nancy said she had suffered small electric shocks before, but this was different. "It didn't go racing through me as the others did. The effect was more like that of a magnet drawing my hand tighter and tighter against the wall. I guess instinct told me not to lean on it. Otherwise, my whole side might have been glued to that panel." Professor Titus wrinkled his brow as if in deep thought. Then he said, "Is the wall covered?" Glenn went to look. "Yes, with wallpaper." The science professor said he believed that under the paper there was a metal plate on a screen attached to the wall itself. Nancy must have been standing on some electric conducting material. Again, Glenn went to peer into the closet. He reported, "There's a rug on the floor." Professor Titus nodded. "Most likely it's made of an electric conducting material. The hidden plate in the wall is no doubt positive, and Nancy is negative. These unlike charges create a strong electrical force which pulled Nancy's hand to the wall and held it there. Somewhere in the building there must be a control device which regulates the flow of electric current. In this case, there was enough to pin Nancy's hand to the wall, but not enough to hurt her permanently." Miss Wilkin had listened carefully. Now she seemed paler than ever. "I do not feel very well," she said. "I would appreciate all of you leaving at once. I will close the museum and go home." Glenn assisted Nancy to her feet and held her arm tightly as the trio walked toward the front door. Assured that Nancy was all right, Miss Wilkin dashed ahead of them. In a couple of minutes, the lights were on once more in the museum. As Nancy neared the entrance, she noticed a pile of booklets on a table nearby. There was a sign alongside them inviting visitors to help themselves. The young detective picked one up and found that it contained a history of the museum and a list of its present officers. Before leaving, Glenn said to Miss Wilkin, "I'd like to investigate that strange wall tomorrow. I'm an expert mechanic and know a lot about electricity and other sources of power." The custodian cut him short. "I'm sorry, but I couldn't allow that. I want no more casualties. In fact, I feel that you people should not come here again." Nancy and Professor Titus looked at each other but made no comment. They said goodbye and left the building. The professor had his car and offered to take Nancy to the fraternity house. She accepted, but said, "I noticed in this booklet that the president of the museum lives in Martin City and has an insurance office there. Glenn, could you take me over there tomorrow morning to call on him? His name is Mr. Schneider, and here is the address on Main Street." "I'll be glad to, of course," Glenn replied. "What time would you like to take off? Is 9 o'clock okay?" "Perfect." He said goodbye to Nancy and Professor Titus, and with a grin added, Nancy, I believe now what your friends say about you, that you never go anywhere without having an adventure. She laughed and waved as he took a shortcut toward the airfield to get his helicopter. She and Professor Titus went to his car, and they drove to the Mega Chi Epsilon house. When Nancy walked into the guest room, Bess and George were there changing clothes. They looked at her hard, then Bess exclaimed, Nancy, something has happened to you. You're as white as a sheet. Nancy flopped onto the bed and stretched out. I do feel a little worn out, she admitted. Briefly and haltingly, she told what had occurred at the museum. Bess gasped. Nancy, you might have been killed, she exclaimed. George felt Nancy's pulse. I don't think you need a doctor, she said, but your pulse is on the slow side. I recommend you stay in bed until tomorrow morning. Nancy did not argue. All she wanted to do was go to sleep. She realized the shock to her nervous system had been greater than she at first thought. Knowing how much good Glenn's massaging of her arm had done, she asked George to give her a stimulating rub-down. George complied at once. She had learned some physiotherapy techniques through a course in gymnastics. Within minutes, Nancy was asleep. It was nearly 10 o'clock that evening when she awakened. Nancy opened her eyes to see Bess, George, Bert, and Dave in the room. They had not made a sound and were watching Nancy carefully to make sure she was all right. With vigor that startled her friends, Nancy sat up and rubbed her eyes. Hi, everybody, she said. You all can stop worrying. I'm fine. She grinned. I'm hungry. It must be very late, but is there any chance of getting something to eat? Her friends were so relieved to hear this good report that each one offered to prepare something for her. Bert and Dave waved Bess and George aside. We know what Nancy likes, Bert said. We'll get her something to eat, and maybe we'll bring a snack for the rest of us. The boys brought an excellent meal of hamburgers on buns and a fancy fruit and ice cream parfait. It was a relaxing end to a trying day. Relieved and happy that Nancy was all right, the group finally said goodnight. The following morning, Bess and George drove Nancy out to the airfield to meet Glenn. They took off at once and were in Martin City before 10 o'clock. Glenn inquired the way to Main Street and found Mr. Snyder's office. Fortunately, he was not in conference and said he would see the callers at once. Henry Schneider was a good-looking, pleasant man. Please sit down, he said. What can I do for you? Nancy began her story by saying she was interested in the Anderson Museum and its mystery. In trying to solve it, she herself had had a frightening experience. A mystery, you say? The insurance officer asked. Don't you know anything about it? Nancy queried in surprise. The man shook his head. I must admit I seldom go to the museum. I depend on Miss Wilkin to keep me posted. And you haven't heard about what happened yesterday afternoon? Glenn spoke up. No, I haven't, Mr. Schneider replied. Please tell me everything. Nancy gave him the details of her first visit to the museum, when the glowing eye had appeared on a wall. Then she told about going there the previous day, after learning from Mr. Fane that the glowing eye had been removed. Nancy went on. Miss Wilkin assumed that students from Emerson who had been working there had taken it. When she showed the list of names to Professor Titus, he said that not one of them attended Emerson. This is amazing, Mr. Schneider remarked. A small group of young men, headed by a somewhat older man with red hair, came here a few months ago and asked if they might rent a small corner of the museum to carry on some harmless experiments. Glenn smiled. They're far from harmless. He told the insurance man what had happened to Nancy. Mr. Schneider's eyes opened wide. This is criminal, he said. I'll certainly try to track down these people. He turned to Nancy. In the meantime, I'll warn Miss Wilkin not to let anybody into the museum without proper credentials. By the way, Nancy, you haven't told me how you first became interested in it. The young detective explained that her father was a lawyer and had a case which indirectly involved the museum. I don't know what it is specifically, but Dad asked me to try to find out something about the mystery. So I came up here. He excused himself and answered the call. Oh. At that moment, Mr. Schneider's phone rang. He excused himself and answered the call. He listened a moment and then declared, "You can't do that." He listened a few minutes, frowning deeply, finally said, "Well, if you insist, but I'll have to figure it out. I'll send you a check for the amount I owe you." He said goodbye and put the phone down. "That was Miss Wilkin," he explained. "She has resigned." "What?" Glenn exclaimed. Nancy told the insurance man that Miss Wilkin had complained last evening of not feeling well. "Maybe she's ill," the young detective said. "Possibly," Mr. Schneider replied. "But I believe this mystery you've been talking about is partly responsible for her sudden resignation. Why, that museum has been her pet for years. Something must have frightened the woman dreadfully to make her leave in such a hurry." Nancy remarked that perhaps Miss Wilkin knew more about the strange events there than she cared to tell. "I think I'll go see her. Where does she live?" Mr. Schneider replied, "Miss Wilkins said she was calling from somewhere else, that she had left town and did not know when she would return." Nancy sat lost in thought. Here was a new angle to the mystery. Was Miss Wilkin involved in the strange affair? The young detective was brought out of her reverie by a remark from Mr. Schneider. "Miss Wilkin didn't go to the museum this morning, so the place is closed." "That's unfortunate. I guess it'll have to remain shut until we can get someone else to act as hostess." A sudden idea flashed into Nancy's mind. "Mr. Schneider," she said, "I have two girlfriends staying at Emerson with me while we work on the mystery. Would you consider letting us pinch hit for Miss Wilkin?" Mr. Schneider thought about the offer for several seconds, then said, "That's very good of you, but frankly I wish we could invite a scientist to try finding an explanation to what has been going on." Nancy told him that perhaps Professor Titus could come. "Excellent idea," Mr. Schneider said. "Can you call him from here?" Nancy nodded. In a few minutes she had Professor Titus on the line. He readily accepted the invitation to work at the museum for a while. Mr. Schneider was delighted to hear this. "The sooner I get back, the better," Nancy said. "Thank you for seeing us. My friends and I will try to do a good job for you." He smiled. "And solve that mystery," he replied. He took a key from a filing cabinet and an architect's drawings of the museum. "These should help you," he said, "but do be careful. I don't want you to injure yourself again." Nancy promised. Then she and Glenn said goodbye and left the insurance office. They went back to the airfield and Glenn took Nancy to Emerson. As they parted, he held her hand and added, "Anytime you need me, let me know and I'll come flying in." She smiled her appreciation and said, "I'll do just that." She phoned Bess and George and they came to pick her up. When they heard about their new assignment, the cousins were excited, but Bess was leery of the job. "Goodness only knows what may happen to us." "Don't be chicken," George said to her. "All this is not only going to solve the mystery, but also capture the real villain." "That's right," Nancy said quietly, "and in turn lead us to Ned." Chapter 16. Astonishing Discovery. That evening, the young people discussed every angle of the Tangled mystery, but always came back to the subject of Ned Nickerson. Where was he? Bert said, "I'm sure Crossan or whoever kidnapped Ned knows that two hiding places are under surveillance. He'd be stupid to return to either one. George spoke up. Then where would he go? I wish I knew, Bert replied. But I feel strongly that Crossan may ditch the copter somewhere and hide out in a new place with Ned. Dave remarked with a groan that this would mean practically starting all over again to solve the mystery. Yes, Bess agreed. Oh dear, we haven't any clues left to follow. What are we going to do? Up to now, Nancy had said nothing. An idea was formulating in her mind, however. Finally, George said, Nancy Drew, what's whirling around in that brain of yours? You have the kind of faraway look you get when you're planning to go off on a new tack. Nancy smiled. I admit I'm thinking about another approach to the mystery. Give me time. If nothing comes of my plan, I don't want to be shown up before you other detectives. Her friends laughed and Bess asked, Oh, how many occasions have you been wrong? I can't think of any. Dave said, Nancy's hunches usually turn out to be right, but at times, he paused, she has some harrowing experiences before drawing her mystery to a conclusion. Pretty soon everyone began to yawn, and finally good nights were exchanged. Bert told the girls that he and Dave had an appointment after Sunday chapel services the next day. We may not see you in the morning. You're going to the museum, aren't you? Nancy nodded and said if anything unusual or exciting happened, she would telephone the boys. Directly after breakfast the following morning, the girls tidied their room, then drove off to pick up Professor Titus. After greeting them all, he climbed into the front seat with Nancy, who headed for the chapel. When the service was over, they drove directly to the Anderson Museum. Professor Titus turned to Nancy. Are you going to solve the mystery today? He asked, with a twinkle in his eyes. Why not? She bantered. Then, becoming serious, she added, the authorities haven't captured Zach Crossan with Ned, and we all think that the kidnapper has a new hideout. And we haven't the vaguest idea where it is, Beth spoke up, although I personally suspect Nancy has a hunch. Nancy made no comment, and in a little while they reached the museum. She unlocked the front entrance and they all went in. Professor Titus snapped on the hall light. Nancy, he said, suppose you give us each a job to do. I am not very well acquainted with the exhibits here. Perhaps I should familiarize myself with them in order to be able to answer any questions visitors might ask. Nancy said that she had formulated a plan of action for the group, but it had more to do with solving the mystery than it did with visitors. I suggest that Bess sit here at the hall desk where Miss Wilkin used to be. Bess, you take the admission money and hand each caller one of these visitor maps of the building. George suggested that her cousin study each newcomer carefully. If she felt suspicious about any person, she immediately was to call her friends to the lobby. Nancy asked Professor Titus if he would go into the room where they had seen the glowing eye and watch the wall carefully. If anything unusual takes place, give a shrill whistle and we'll all come running. George spoke up. What's my assignment? Nancy said that she and George would explore upstairs. I guess it's not part of the museum itself because Miss Wilkin didn't mention it as such, and the map with directions to the exhibits show only the first floor. How do we get to the second floor? George asked. I don't see a stairway anywhere. The young detective told her that they would have to hunt for it. She pointed out that the little map had a ST on a spot in the rear hall, which probably indicated a door leading to a stairway. The two girls went off and soon found the door. It opened easily and revealed a rather steep set of steps. Nancy led the way to the second floor, where there were several bedrooms with baths. Nancy and George went from one to another. They were in perfect order and did not seem to have been used recently. I guess nobody slept up here, George said as they came to the last room. Uh-oh, I was wrong, she added suddenly. Though there were no clothes in sight, the bed looked as if it had been hastily and badly made, and there were soiled towels carelessly slung over racks in the bathroom. Nancy remarked that she was sure Miss Wilkin had not stayed in the room. She's too neat to have left the place looking like this. Then who was it? George asked. I'll bet you're thinking of Zap Crossan. Nancy smiled. Yes, I'm thinking just that, but I'm also wondering if Ned was with him. George said she doubted it because Ned would have left some kind of clue, hoping Nancy would find it. Both girls began a thorough search of borrowed drawers and even pulled the bed apart. They found nothing to help solve the mystery. I don't think, George said, Miss Wilkin knew anyone was using the place for diabolical schemes. Zap probably worked on his weird inventions when she was not on duty. On the other hand, Nancy countered, Miss Wilkin may have been intimidated by him to keep still, but our sleuthing frightened her, and she resigned in a hurry. Perplexed, the girls started to walk back to the stairway. At that moment, they heard a thud on the third floor. The two young detectives stared at each other. Was the intruder up there? Both girls had noticed a door, which probably led to the third floor. Nancy tried to open it, but the door was locked. I'd like to look up there, Nancy said. Maybe there's a key to this door downstairs somewhere. Before going there to hunt for it, George said she would look in all the furniture drawers on the second floor. Nancy assisted, but the girls had no luck. In the meantime, there was no further sounds from the third floor. Perhaps no one's up there, George decided. Something just gave way and fell. The girls went to the first floor and began another search. When they came to the entrance hall, they asked Bess to look in the desk. There was no key in it. Did you hear a thud upstairs? George asked her cousin. Bess nodded. I thought one of you knocked something over. It was on the third floor, George told her. We were on the second. Bess made a face and hunched her shoulders. More spookiness. I'll be glad when 5 o'clock comes. We haven't had a single visitor. Maybe other people have had strange experiences here. Nancy and George went into the large room where Professor Titus was on guard. He reported nothing had happened, but he said he too had heard the thud and had assumed the girls had caused it. When he learned otherwise, he did not take it lightly. Somebody may be up there. If so, we should call the police. Nancy said she would like to investigate the third floor before doing this. Perhaps there's a ladder in the basement and I can climb up. She and the other girls found none. Nancy suggested that they hunt for a secret stairway to the third floor. Let's examine the chimney and the center of the house first. They made a search but stayed away from the wall, which had proved dangerous for Nancy. Once more they met with disappointment. Now will you please give in, Nancy, the professor urged. One of us should call the police. All right, she said, and went to the entrance lobby to put in the call. At once, Beth spoke up. Don't use the phone. It's dead. I tried to call the boys at the fraternity house, but come over here. I have something very exciting to show you. Nancy, George, and Professor Titus hurried to the desk where Bess was seated. I made a discovery, she said. After you asked me to look for the key, I thought I'd make a better search in the drawer, and I found this. She showed the others a handwritten book of verses and began to read some of them. They're weird, Professor Titus remarked. Who wrote these? In answer, Bess opened the book to the first page. Written on it was, To my lovely and understanding aunt, Beatrice Wilkin, from Cyclops. Chapter 17. Chapter 17. Paralyzing Light. Beatrice Wilkin, the aunt of Cyclops? Everyone crowded around the small desk where Bess was seated and stared at the book she had found in the drawer. I can't believe it, George burst out. That prim little woman, the aunt of a criminal. Nancy suggested that they look inside the book for further information. Everyone was astounded at the contents and puzzled as to why Miss Wilkin had left the book there. You would think, Professor Titus spoke up, that she would want to conceal such information. Bess sighed. Oh, she probably forgot to take it with her because she was in such a hurry to get away. As the group read on, there's only praise for the elderly custodian who had permitted Cyclops to sleep on the second floor of the museum and to carry on certain experiments in the building. This means Cyclops is one person, Nancy deduced, not a gang. But what about his pals? George spoke up. How much did they know? Read this, Nancy said presently. Cyclops actually experimented on the glowing eye project right here, and Miss Woken knew all about it. George asked, do you suppose she could have worked hand in hand with her nephew? That seems incredible, Professor Titus replied. I'm more inclined to think that Miss Woken did not understand the invention. When several people inquired about it, she became suspicious herself. Then, after what happened to Nancy yesterday, the woman panicked and left suddenly. Nancy was not completely satisfied with this explanation. Did Miss Wilkin believe that Cyclops pals were Emerson College students? Or had she lied to Nancy and her friends when asked about them? The discussion was interrupted by a knock on the front door. The professor opened it and admitted a man who said he was Ben Farley from the telephone company. We received complaints from people who have tried to call here. Apparently your line's out of order. Nancy pulled out the map of the museum's first floor and looked carefully for the main telephone box location. She found it, and the repairman suggested that the incoming line was probably underground in a basement, not shown on the directions. Professor Titus and the girls went with him. They found the box. The repairman said. Someone cut the line. After examining the break carefully, Farley asked, did you have a burglary? Professor Titus said he did not think so, but they had just discovered that an intruder had slept on the second floor. The telephone man went out to his truck to get special wire and tools. The others returned to the lobby and continued to read the book of poems by Cyclops. There are many items which seem to identify Cyclops as Zap Crossan. One was a poem in which the words cross and on were used to describe an ill-tempered little boy with fiery red hair. He must have been describing himself as a child, George declared. Nancy said she was sure Crossan would return to the museum and perhaps bring his pals with him. I feel this place should be guarded, she said. At once Professor Titus offered to stay. But not alone, Nancy said. I certainly think Bess and George and I should remain with you. Just then the telephone repairman came back to the lobby and reported that service on the line had been restored. That's good, said Bess. It's kind of eerie being in a place like this without a telephone. Ben Farley smiled and said if there was any further trouble to contact the company, he drove off. The first person I should call, said Nancy, is my dad. Professor Titus said he would like to let his wife know the change of plans and why he would not be home. Beth spoke up. I think Bert and Dave should be told too. Yes, George agreed. And besides, we should find out if they have had any news of Ned, either from him or from the authorities. The calls were made. Bert and Dave were surprised and concerned for their friend's safety, but thought that the girls' plan to keep an overnight watch was a good one. We haven't heard anything from or about Ned, Bert added. When all the phoning was finished, Bess glanced at her watch. Do you know it's dinner time? She asked. Suppose I phone a restaurant in town and see if they deliver some food to us. Hopefully she tried one place after another and was beginning to think the group would have to go all night without eating when she found a roadside restaurant that did deliver meals. The food arrived within an hour. They sat on chairs in the main lobby to eat. After they finished, each one began to nod and close his eyes. They took turns walking around, trying to stay awake. But by 10 o'clock, everyone was back in his chair and getting into a comfortable position for a nap. All the lights had been turned out, and the watchers remained silent until sleep overcame them. No one knew how long they had dozed when suddenly the group was awakened by a strong, penetrating searchlight flashed in their faces. As the startled group concentrated on it, everyone realized that the light seemed to be emitted from a huge, glowing eye. Nancy's first thought was to make a dash for the person holding the searchlight. To her amazement, she found herself unable to get up. She stared stupefied at the others. Each one sat paralyzed. Suddenly, a voice that seemed to come from far away said, "Don't try to follow me, even after you can move again." At once, the huge light went out, and the immobile group could vaguely hear the front door open and close. The person with the glowing eye searchlight had left. It was fully 5 minutes before anyone could move or speak. Slowly, Nancy arose and made her way to the telephone on the desk. As she lifted the phone, a light went on showing up the numbers. She dialed the police emergency number and got headquarters. A sergeant on duty promised to send men out right away. Nancy turned on the lights in the lobby and asked the others how they were feeling. Fortunately, no one had suffered any bad effects. "That was a strange experience," Professor Titus remarked. "Have you any explanation for it?" Nancy asked him. "Not exactly," he replied, "but it reminds me of something I read about medical students studying the brainwaves of a person who had been put to sleep under hypnosis. It was discovered that his wave pattern could be imprinted upon another brain by using a laser beam of a certain wavelength. Of course, the original brainwaves had to be programmed in order to be modulated. This in turn produced a paralyzing sleep." Nancy was thoughtful. What happened to us must have been done some other way because nobody hypnotized us, and the programming would have been different for each individual in the group. "That's right," Professor Titus agreed. "The phenomenon we experience will take a good deal of study." Bess's eyes were wide open. "Who would ever think of such a horrible invention?" Professor Titus smiled. "Criminals conjure up many things that ordinarily seem beyond their capabilities. I think I've made a discovery. The person who gave us the warning a few minutes ago sounded exactly like Zap Crossan." "Maybe he has been on the floor for all this time," George suggested. "I'll run up and see if the door leading to it is unlocked." In a couple of minutes, she reported that the door was still tightly locked. Bess looked frightened. "Are you saying that Zap Crossan is up there with his paralyzing searchlight and may come back any time to use it on us again?" Nancy said she doubted this because they had heard the front door close. "I don't think he'll return here for a while." She picked up the phone once more and contacted police headquarters. This time, she asked them to send out a detective who was also a locksmith. 10 minutes later, a car with several officers reached the museum. One of them was Dr. Marcus, the police surgeon. He insisted upon examining each victim of the paralyzing searchlight. He tested their responses and announced that the whole group was in good health. He asked them how they felt during the immobile period. Professor Titus and the girls said they had no unusual sensations except being unable to move. "May we please go upstairs and watch you open the door?" Nancy asked the locksmith detective. "Certainly," he answered. "My name is Tim Rooney." The whole group trooped up the stairway and watched as the detective tried one key after another. Finally, he was able to unlock the door. The girls wanted to rush up to the top floor, but Dr. Marcus said, "No, not until we find it safe." A few minutes later, he came down. "It's okay. You're in for a surprise," he remarked. "There's a fully equipped electrical and electronic lab up there." "How amazing," said Professor Titus. By this time, Nancy had surmised as much. She led the way up the steps. What particularly drew her attention in the spacious attic room were a series of pictures on the walls. They depicted gruesome scenes of battles, both between individuals and groups, and the slaughter of animals. "How ghastly!" Bess exclaimed. By now, everyone was staring at the pictures of persons and animals about to have one eye gouged out with various kinds of hand weapons. Bess covered her eyes with her hands, just as Dr. Marcus said. The man who owns these pictures is an unusual and dangerous killer type. Nancy's heart jumped. And he's holding Ned. She could not finish the sentence. Chapter 18. Weird heel mark. Why, Nancy, you're white as a sheet, Bess exclaimed. What's the matter? I was just thinking about what Crossan could do to Ned. George put an arm around her friend. Please don't think the worst. I'm sure we'll capture that villain before he has a chance to do anything drastic. She went on to say that if Crossan were trying to get information out of Ned, he was not likely to kill him. But he might maim him, Nancy said with tears in her eyes. She buried her face in her hands and took a long, deep breath. A few seconds later, she raised her head and said, You're absolutely right, George. I mustn't let my feelings overshadow my good sense. She changed the subject by turning to Tim Rooney and asking if he would supply her with the key to the door leading to the attic. He smiled and said, You hope to trap the kidnapper right here in his own laboratory? Nancy nodded. And Detective Rooney told her he would have a duplicate key made at once and bring it to her. One of the other officers now asked Professor Titus and the girls to leave the attic. We want to search this place thoroughly for the glowing eye searchlight, he said. Also, there may be other dangerous gadgets here which we should remove. Nancy and the others went to the main lobby. George asked Nancy, What's our next assignment? The young detective replied, I'd like to do some old-fashioned sleuthing. Oh, Professor Titus guards the museum. How about the rest of us take flashlights and magnifying glasses outdoors to search? We're pretty sure that Crescent was here tonight. Perhaps he left footprints. The professor agreed. The girls took sleuthing equipment from pockets and handbags, then went outside to examine the grounds. A few minutes later, Nancy's eyes were fastened on a trail of footprints, which her flashlight and magnifying glass had revealed. Look, she cried out. The cousins came to her side. They saw the prints and presently found an identical one deep in a soft spot. The heel mark is a copy of Cyclops' glowing eye, Nancy exclaimed as she pointed to it. Clearly pictured was the ugly face of a Cyclops with an eye in the center of his forehead. George asked, Do you think this is a mark Crossan uses just for himself, or is it the insignia for his pals too? Nancy admitted she did not know, but I'm going to tell the police about this mark. The girls went back into the museum. They were just in time to meet the police officers coming from the attic. We found nothing dangerous, Tim Rooney reported, so it'll be all right for you to go up there, Miss Drew, but be very careful just the same. I have something to show you, Nancy spoke up. It's outdoors. Please follow me to the side of the house. She led the policeman to the spot where she had discovered the heel print. The men stared at it perplexed. One said, This is very strange. I'll call headquarters and see if they have any data on a similar mark. They all returned to the museum lobby and he made the call. After listening for over 5 minutes, the officer said, I'll pass along the information. This is most interesting. He put down the phone and explained that a long time ago, a band of wizards was reported to have lived in Europe. These men pretended to be magicians. Actually, they were a gang of thieves. They mesmerized anyone who got in the way of their activities. Perhaps, Nancy commented, the wizards were able to cause a temporary paralysis in people, and that's where Crossan got his idea for the paralyzing eye. The officer looked directly at Nancy. Do you think your friend Ned Nickerson had anything to do with inventing the glowing eye? No, she answered quickly. I suspect that Ned was working on something else which he was keeping a secret, but Crossan found out what it was and tried to steal the invention. But so far Ned has refused to give it to Crossan. Before anyone could comment, they heard a loud knock on the front door. One of the officers went to answer it. The caller proved to be Tim Rooney. He laughed and said, You all look as if you expected a monster. I'm just plain old Tim Rooney. George spoke up. It wouldn't have surprised us if a monster had arrived. Actually, we thought the caller might be a wizard. Where'd you get that idea? Mr. Rooney laughed. Nancy told him what had been discovered. Bless me. Discovered during his absence. He was intrigued by the story of the ancient gang of wizards. I'm not one of them, he said, smiling, although I have a reputation for being able to open any locked door with my special keys. Miss Drew, here's the key to the museum attic. Hope you catch your man real soon. The officers made a monologue of the strange heel print and left after they had warned the group not to take any chances. The girls talked with Professor Titus for several minutes. Then he walked into the room where the glowing eye had shone on the wall. Listen, Bess said suddenly. I hear a car coming. The girls wondered who was arriving. They felt sure it was not Crossan nor one of Cyclops' pals. A few seconds later, there was a loud knock on the door. Nancy asked who was there. Two male voices said, You're guards for the night. The girls burst out laughing. Bert and Dave! Bess quickly pulled open the front door, and the boys walked in. Bert was grinning. We thought you girls needed more protection. Just then, Professor Titus returned to the group. So you boys didn't trust me to take care of them alone? He asked, his eyes twinkling. Bert and Dave knew he was teasing them, but they were a little embarrassed. Dave said, Sorry, Professor. Of course you could have done the job, but we kind of like to hang around. That's a lame explanation, the man replied, pretending to be as critical as he was sometimes known to be in his classroom. Nancy spoke up. Now that you boys are here, we'll put you to work. First, we'll tell you all about this evening's events, then give you jobs. The two boys were astounded at the latest developments, and Dave said, As usual, more things can happen to Nancy Drew and her friends in 2 hours than might happen in 2 years to somebody else. The young detective smiled, then said, Let's watch this museum closely. I suggest we divide forces and spread out. Good idea, Bert said. Where do you want to station me? Suppose you and I go to the attic, Nancy answered. Wait until you see that fabulous laboratory. She went on to assign jobs to the others. Professor Titus and George were to station themselves near the panel where the glowing eye had been seen. Bess and Dave how about guarding the front door? The group quickly dispersed and went to their individual posts. Nancy and Bert hurried upstairs to the second floor. Then Nancy opened the attic door with a key she had just received. She flicked on the light switch and closed the door. Bert followed her up the steps. In a moment he was gazing in awe at the equipment. Nancy in the meantime heard what sounded like a helicopter. Was it Crossan? She quickly turned off the light and told Bert to look out the window with her. They could see a helicopter descending in the field behind the museum. Bert, I'll bet it's Crossan, Nancy exclaimed. Together they watched the whirlybird. Both had the same thought. Was it the robot craft which had landed on Nancy's front lawn in River Heights? Maybe Crossan and Ned are in it, Bert suggested. The helicopter settled to the ground, but instantly went up again. It circled for a few minutes, then took off. Maybe some of them dropped out, Nancy remarked. He may come into the museum, Bert added. Just then they heard a scream from the first floor. Chapter 19, The Captive. We're getting closer. Who had screamed? Someone in their group or an intruder? Nancy was torn between two theories. The cry might have come from Bess, who had been frightened, but on the other hand, an intruder might have screamed purposely to lure Bert and herself from the attic. Regardless, she felt that they should investigate. Suppose I go, Nancy suggested. You wait here in case Crossan or one of his pals climbs in a window or comes out of a secret hiding place. Nancy tiptoed down the attic steps. She opened the door warily and gazed into the dark hall. There was not a sound, and to her this seemed ominous. As she stood debating whether or not to descend to the first floor, she noticed a small flicker of light. In a moment, she realized that someone was coming up the steps. She could not see the person's face, but she could distinguish the outline of a man. In one hand, he held the paralyzing glowing eye searchlight. Its beams had been turned low. I'd better make up my mind what I'm going to do, Nancy thought. A moment later, a distressing thought came to her. Maybe her friends on the first floor had been paralyzed again by the glowing eye searchlight. The same thing will happen to me if I go near it. Quickly, she stepped back onto the attic stairway and closed the door. Ascending on tiptoe as rapidly as possible, she went at once to Bert's side and whispered, Cyclops may be on his way up here with his paralyzing light. We'd better hide. And also try to figure out how we're going to capture him, Bert said, without being paralyzed ourselves. Their flashlights turned on. The two moved quietly around the lab looking for something they could use to capture the man. Nancy, noticing a long black cloth in one corner of the lab, and picked it up. It proved to be a perforated sack. That is just the thing to pull over that villain's head, Bert remarked. It'll stop him, but it won't smother him. Nancy agreed and said she thought their best hiding place would be somewhere behind the door of the closet where bottles of chemicals were kept. By leaving the door ajar, they could watch the person's actions. By now, someone was climbing the steps to the attic. Nancy and Bert waited breathlessly. When he reached the lab, he at once turned up the beam of his searchlight and cast it over the room. Nancy and Bert could not be seen and were safe from its harmful rays. Bert clutched the sack and watched the intruder dim his searchlight. In the crack of light shining into the closet, Bert held up a finger and crooked it to form the letter C. He followed with an R. Nancy realized that he was spelling Crossan. She and Bert waited for their chance. Crossan walked closer and closer to the closet. Just before reaching it, he turned his back on the door. This was Bert and Nancy's opportunity to capture him. Like lightning, they sprang from the closet. Bert pulled the sack over the man's head, while Nancy held his arms tightly to his sides. The movement startled Crossan so much that he fell and dropped the searchlight. Fortunately, its beams had been diverted from Bert and Nancy. Nancy reached out and with one foot shut off the power. By now, Bert had managed to tie the lower part of the sack around the man's waist. The prisoner struggled to get away. His muscles were strong. Nancy realized that he must be bound more securely. She snapped on the ceiling light and looked for something with which to bind their prisoner. She found a coil of electric wire and tied the man's ankles tightly, while Bert tried hard to keep the sack over his head and his arms pinned down. Next, Nancy wound the rest of the wire about his body so he could not free himself. Let me out of here, the prisoner screamed. Bert looked at Nancy, who nodded, and the sack was taken from Crossan's head. Nancy thought she had never seen an angrier, more calculating smirk on anyone's face. The man's fiery red hair was sticking out in all directions. His eyes were like two gleaming coals as hatred shone in them. Let me go, he shouted. Nancy looked at him and asked, Where's Ned Nickerson? Instead of answering, Crossan cried out, You'd better release me or you'll all die. Since the man was unable to use either his arms or legs, Nancy and Bert were sure that the threat was only an idle one. Nancy said she would go to the first floor and get Professor Titus to identify Crossan. Upon hearing this, Crossan's eyes closed to a mere slit. Nancy thought he looked like a tiger about to spring upon its prey. She hurried from the room and ran to the lobby. The scene before her startled the young detective. It was evident that Bess, George, Dave, and Professor Titus had received a dose from the paralyzing searchlight. Fortunately, they were all regaining their ability to move. Zab Crossan is our prisoner in the attic, Nancy exclaimed. Professor Titus, will you go up there with me to identify him? Yeah, shouted Dave. Hypers, George said. You've done it again, Nancy Drew. The young detective still looked sober. He won't answer my question about where Ned is, but I'm going back to see if I can find out anything. Then she asked, tell me exactly what happened down here. Bess explained that she had seen the front door open silently and the red-haired Cyclops had come in with his paralyzing searchlight and immediately beamed it on Dave and her, but she had managed to scream. George and Professor Titus had come running, and in turn had received an electrical shock. Not only Professor Titus, but Bess, George, and Dave accompanied Nancy to the attic. The professor took one look at the prisoner and said, It's Zap Crossan, all right. Then he glanced at the turned-off searchlight, which was still lying on the floor. He picked it up and examined the strange gadget. It would no longer switch on, and he declared that the mechanism had worn out. Nancy went to stand in front of the prisoner. Again she asked, Where's Ned Nickerson? Crossan eyed her skeptically. Let me loose and I'll tell you a lot, he replied. The others waited for him to give an explanation about the kidnapping. Instead, he suddenly began to laugh. I know you're going to have me arrested, but the authorities have no charge on which to hold me. They have no proof of anything. I have permission to stay in this museum and to work in this laboratory. That's not against the law. I'll deny everything else I'm accused of. That goes for your boyfriend, Nancy Drew. I happen to know he's safe, but I'll never be able to leave the place where he's being held unless I give the word. The red-haired man stopped speaking and refused to answer any further questions. When Nancy realized that for her to continue was hopeless, she decided to call the police and turn the whole matter over to them. She hurried to the first floor and dialed the number. Tim Rooney answered. Don't tell me you've caught the intruder, he said. Yes, I'm reporting just that, Nancy replied. But he won't tell where Ned Nickerson is. Can some of your men come to the museum at once and take charge? They'll be there shortly, Tim Rooney told her, then said how astounded he was that Nancy Drew had caught the kidnapper. When two other officers arrived, they were equally amazed. Nancy led them at once to the third-floor laboratory. Crossan glared at the officers and instantly told the men that they had no case against him. I demand that you release me, he said. There's already a warrant out for your arrest, one of the officers told him. And if we need any proof, I think there are several witnesses right here in this room who will testify against you in court. The men searched the prisoner's pockets. When they found nothing, they untied the electric cord which had bound him, slipped on handcuffs, and let Crossan stand. We'll lock him up, one officer said. Turning to Nancy, said, Just how did you solve this case? By 1923 pennies, the young detective replied. Crossan gave a start and cast an ugly look in Nancy's direction. The officer asked, Where will I be able to find you people? Professor Titus said he thought the group should return to Emerson at once for a good night's sleep. Everyone agreed. The police were given the telephone number of the fraternity house. By the time they reached Emerson, it was daybreak. The whole group tumbled into bed, exhausted. What a day, Bess said as she closed her eyes and trailed off to sleep. George immediately followed her cousin, but after Nancy had relaxed for half an hour without dozing off, her mind began to race. She wished that Ned had been rescued instead of Crossan having been captured. We'll have to start another big search, she said to herself. Presently, the young detective became so restless, she decided to get up, dress, and walk around the campus. Maybe a long stroll would help her figure out what her next move should be. She went outside and crossed the campus to a large playing field. Hearing a noise above her, she looked up and saw a helicopter coming. As Nancy watched it, she was startled to see the craft pause directly overhead, then begin to descend. Her heart pounding, she asked herself, "Is this the robot copter? And if so, why is it coming here?" Suddenly it occurred to Nancy that one or more of Croston's pals might be aboard. Should she run and avoid being captured? The young detective was too intrigued to leave. The helicopter might contain another message from Ned. Chapter 20. Surprising story. As the helicopter descended closer to Nancy, she became more and more tense. The craft settled to the ground. The rotor slowed down and finally stopped. As Nancy stared, the door opened and the pilot jumped out. Suddenly, Nancy caught her breath. Then she started to run toward the young man as fast as she could. "Ned! Ned! I can't believe it!" she cried out. Realizing who she was, Ned too began to run. A few moments later, they were in each other's arms. "Oh, Nancy, I'm so glad you're the first one to greet me on my homecoming." "Ned, you're safe!" she exclaimed. This brought a twinkle to the good-looking young man's brown eyes. "There's so much to find out about where you've been," Nancy continued. "And how did you ever get away from where Carlson had hidden you?" Ned looked at Nancy unbelievingly. "You found out who my abductor was?" By this time, Nancy and Ned were walking arm in arm toward the fraternity house. "I've been working on the case. Last night we captured Zap Carson, and he's in jail now." "Thank goodness for that," Ned replied. "Don't think I could have taken much more. Carson grew nuttier all the time, and I was afraid he would kill me. Oh, you wanted to know where he has kept me hidden lately and how I got away." "I know it wasn't the farmhouse nor the cabin in the swampy wilderness because the police are watching both places," Nancy asked. "You arranged that?" he asked. Nancy told him that she had been working with Bess, George, Bert, and Dave, and Professor Titus was very helpful too. Ned revealed that Carson had a third hideout. It was an abandoned army post with a level but rather overgrown flying field. Whenever Carson took me anyplace, I paid strict attention to how and where he piloted the copter. A couple of times he let me fly it. Last evening, a friend of his came and took Carson away in the copter. I think to the Anderson Museum, but only the friend returned with the craft. "Where is he now?" Nancy asked. Ned said that the man had gone off in his car after giving him some supper. I asked him how long Carson would be away, and he said at least a couple of days. That gave me an idea. Carson had not chained me as tightly as he had at the other two places, and after a while I was able to get loose. I determined to try find the copter, but I didn't dare set it down in any airport. I know I was breaking aviation rules. However, due to the circumstances, I'm sure it won't have any trouble with the authorities." "Was the glowing eye his own invention?" "Yes, and he experimented it with several ways, making it turn red, using a paralyzing type and a searchlight, and trying out a miniature indestructible one. But he put a speaking tape in it, so if anyone should pick up the eye and open the lid, it would sound a warning. Preston didn't want anyone to discover his secret. He also magnetized the inner wall below where the big eye appeared in the museum. It's put there to trap anyone investigating the spot." "I know," said Nancy. "It happened to me." "What?" Ned exclaimed. "That scoundrel!" "Well, I'm glad he couldn't finish his invention. He needed mine to perfect his own for commercial uses." "Oh, I'm so glad he never got it," Nancy said. "Ned, what about the eye that glowed on one of your notes? Who put it there?" "The paper was from a pad of crossings." "And the drawing on the paper at your home that was eye-shaped and had numbers on it?" Nancy asked. Ned grinned. "That was my secret. Sometime I'll explain it to you." Tell me, how did Carson happen to adopt the name Cyclops? Nancy asked. He became interested in the origin of the word and made his invention in the shape of a huge eye. Then he decided to call himself Cyclops. When I sent the note to you, I didn't dare use his real name in case he found it. I also thought Cyclops might be a good clue for you. By this time, the couple had reached the fraternity house. Though it was early, several students were out. When Ned walked in the door, they stared at him as if he were a creature from another planet. Then a great cheer went up. The noise awakened everyone else in the house. And within minutes, Bess, George, Bert, and Dave were surrounding Ned, shaking hands or kissing him and asking 100 questions. Tell you what, fellows and girls, Ned said, winking at Nancy, Bess, and George. Suppose we have breakfast, and while we're eating, I'll tell you everything that happened to me. Now I want to call my parents. Nancy, will you call the police? Yes, and tell them you're safe. After assuring Mr. and Mrs. Nickerson he was all right and promising to see them that evening, Ned went to his room and had the first really good shower he had taken since leaving Emerson. Refreshed, he came downstairs, and all the students and visitors and Professor Titus, whom Bert had invited, assembled in the dining room. Ned ate some fruit and cereal, then got up and began his story. As you know, I worked next to Zab Crossan in the lab. He proved to be a very inquisitive person and was always looking at my notes and watching my experiments. Quite accidentally, I hit upon something which I think will be a worthwhile invention. Crossan thought so too, and secretly determined to steal it from me. At one point, I became a little suspicious, so I gathered up all my formulas and notes relating to my project and mailed them to my home. But what about the helicopter sketches that were in the same package? Nancy interrupted. Excuse me. Crossan used to draw copters all the time. He left a sheet of them on my work table one day. It must have become mixed in with my own papers. Ned paused a moment before continuing his story. He fooled me part of the time. Though I was suspicious of his intentions regarding my invention, I did not suspect he planned to kidnap me and keep me a prisoner until he could get my invention and market it. A week ago yesterday, Crossan came to my room and told me he had a copter which he kept, with special permission, on the farm outside of town. He asked me if I would like to take a ride in it. He seemed so friendly that I was taken off guard and accepted. I had no time to write a note to Bert and Dave, because he insisted we leave at once. We drove out to the farm, and I left the car parked at the side of the road. Everything went well until we got into the copter. Then Crossan suddenly pulled the gun and said I was his prisoner, and he would not release me until I had given him a complete set of drawings and formulas for my invention. Of course I refused, and he took me to that wilderness hideout. How wicked! Bess Marvin burst out. Other students agreed, and there were a few minutes of bitter talk about the graduate student. Finally, Ned went on to relate what else had happened to him. Every time Crossan got word from his pals that the police were on his trail, he moved me. I had an idea it was Nancy who was keeping the police informed. We went from place to place, but they were always in secluded areas. In the beginning, Crossan wanted to scare Nancy off the case so she wouldn't try to solve it. Apparently, he knew of your reputation, Nancy, and also where you lived. He said he could make his copter into a robot, and then he intended to program it to go directly to your house. He was planning a bomb inside it, which was to roll out when the door opened automatically and blow up part of your home. And he even hoped to injure you and your father so you'd be too scared to try finding me. A bomb, George explained. Nothing went off. The police didn't see on the copter. What happened to it? Ned smiled and said that he had talked Crossan into letting him walk outside to see the helicopter when it was ready. I had decided to send Nancy a warning note, so I wrote it and put the note into my pocket. When Crossan had everything set to go, I told him I heard something in the sky. Maybe somebody was coming after us. Of course, he looked up, and this gave me a chance to remove the bomb and put the note into the copter. What did you do with the bomb? Bert spoke up. Ned said he had taken a chance and hid it under his coat. The robocopter was taken off from the hiding place in the wilderness. After it had gone, I told Crossan I wanted to get a certain plant out of the swamp, and he assumed it had something to do with my invention, because he felt sure I was going to give in to his demands. He didn't want to walk into the mucky area himself, so he told me to go ahead, but warned me not to try to escape. I assured him I wouldn't. but went far enough away so that he couldn't see what I was doing. I bent down to pull up a plant, but at the same time I gently placed the bomb underwater," Ned laughed. "I suppose it's still there. We must tell the police about it." As Ned paused, Dave asked, "When Crossan found out the bomb didn't arrive at the Drew home, what did he think?" "That during the flight the bomb must have rolled out and dropped off someplace. Crossan watched the newspapers to see if there was a report of any accident, but he never saw one." Ned told his listeners that when the robot copter did not return to the wilderness hideout, Crossan decided to go see what had happened. It was he who knocked out the police guard at the Drew house, cut the rope which had been used to tie the helicopter down, and flew the craft back where we were staying. After glancing at his wristwatch, Ned answered, "Fellows, it's time for those of you who have classes to leave. Later I'll tell you more about my abduction." Nancy and her special friends went to the guest room and sat down. Fortunately, Bert and Dave had no classes, so they could stay to hear the rest of Ned's story. They learned that Crossan had robbed the Emerson lab to equip his own in the wilderness. Also, that is that the bomb in the file drawer of duplicate papers relating to the glowing eye. He didn't want anyone to see them. Nancy asked, "Ned, is your invention still a secret, or could you tell us about it now?" "I sure can, especially after all the great things you have done for me and captured Cyclops. My invention is a new way for a scientist to produce laser light so that even a small source of energy will do great feats. It's done by converting all the energy into light." "How wonderful!" Nancy exclaimed, feeling particularly proud of her friend. George agreed, also Bert and Dave. Bess made no comment for several seconds. Then she said, "Ned, your invention sounds marvelous, but it's about as clear as mud to me." The others laughed, and it was agreed that Ned would have to go into a far deeper explanation in order to make them fully understand his invention. Before the group broke up, they learned from Ned that Crossan controlled the glowing eye in the museum from his lab there. His pals, who pretended to be Emerson students, had helped him take it down but left all the active wires. Ned explained, "By the way, I have the names of all of Crossan's pals. I'll turn them over to the police. Crossan himself by accident left a paper with the word Cyclops written in Greek among my drawings. He told me this a few days ago, thinking it was a good joke, but he never had a chance to steal the material because I came to the lab just then and I put everything back in my file in a hurry. That very day I mailed all my work home, also the papers I kept in my room here." As Nancy walked to her room, she felt a combination of happiness at Ned's return and a kind of sinking feeling which always came over her when a mystery was solved. But she did not have long to wait for the secret of the Forgotten City to come along and involve her in another exciting adventure. Now, with Crossan in jail and Ned back, Nancy decided to call her father and tell him the good news. She went at once to the phone and called his office. When the lawyer heard the astonishing report, he said, "Congratulations, Nancy. I had a feeling all along you could solve the mystery of the Anderson Museum, which of course turned out to be much more than that. By the way, I never did tell you how the case came to me. A large donor to the museum saw the glowing eye and wondered if his money was being spent unwisely. He asked me to find out. I'll phone him that Nancy Drew found the answer." After a little more conversation with her father, Nancy felt she should tell Marty King that Crossan was in jail and Ned was home. She said to her father, "I'd like to speak to Marty." There was a pause, then Mr. Drew said, "She's no longer working here." "Oh," Nancy exclaimed. "She left?" "Well, yes, but to be truthful, Nancy, I asked her to resign. Her legal work was excellent, but I began to realize that she was always arranging my business affairs so that she and I would have to eat luncheon or dinner together. Then I learned how jealous she was of you and your accomplishments." Nancy was smiling to herself and delighted that Marty King had left her father's employ. "Nancy, dear, I may as well tell you the whole story," her father went on. "I'm embarrassed about it, but what brought on my asking Marty to leave was—" There's a long pause. "When Marty asked me to marry her." Nancy took a deep breath. For a couple of seconds she was not sure what to say to her father. This was a situation which she had never encountered before. Finally she decided to make light of the whole matter. Dad, she said, if you ever want to find me a new mother, please promise me she won't be someone who tries to solve my mysteries. Her father laughed heartily. I promise, he said. All right, guys, that is the end. We have finished the mystery of the glowing eye. Way to go, fishes. Way to go, detectives. We've done it. Another case has rolled right through, and I have not decided what will be next because I wanted to see if I was even going to do this. Finish it. So, if you remember last time, I used this little screen as a moment to talk about my thoughts on